Before we begin, you need to understand something. This isn't about the drug, it's about what we did with it. This is the story of methamphetamine, a molecule, a chemical compound synthesized in a laboratory over a century ago that would go on to fuel the armies of fascist empires, reshape the landscape of American counterculture, and become the justification for militarizing police forces against the poorest and most vulnerable members of society. This is a story about war and medicine, about capitalism and control, about how a substance created in the pursuit of scientific knowledge became a weapon wielded against millions. I need you to understand the scope of what we're about to explore together. This will not be comfortable. It will not offer simple villains or easy heroes. The history of methamphetamine is the history of the 20th century itself, reflected through the lens of a single chemical compound. It reveals truths about power, about who we choose to criminalize and who we choose to protect, about the patterns we repeat generation after generation, despite overwhelming evidence that they cause nothing but suffering. Before we go any further, I'm going to ask something of you. If you're finding value in this exploration, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and in the comments tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I want to know that you're out there, bearing witness to this history with me. Now, phone away, distractions silenced, settle in. What you're about to hear is not propaganda. It's not a moral panic designed to terrify you about the dangers of illicit substances. Yes, methamphetamine has destroyed countless lives. Yes, addiction is real and devastating and worthy of our compassion and our attention. But the substance itself is just chemistry. The story, the real story, is about us, about the choices we made, about the systems we built and the people we sacrificed to maintain them. To understand how we got here, we have to go back to 1893, to a laboratory in Tokyo, where a chemist named Nagayoshi Nagai had no idea what he was about to unleash. The late 19th century was an age of chemical discovery. Scientists across the world were isolating compounds from plants, synthesizing new molecules, exploring the vast unmapped territory of organic chemistry. In laboratories from Berlin to London to Tokyo, researchers were breaking down the natural world into its constituent parts and reassembling them in novel configurations. Some of these experiments would yield life-saving medicines, others would produce weapons. Most would simply expand the boundaries of human knowledge, their ultimate applications unknowable at the moment of discovery. Nagayoshi Nagai was a professor of pharmaceutical chemistry at the University of Tokyo. His work focused on a traditional Chinese medicinal herb called ma huang, known in the West as ephedra. For thousands of years, practitioners of Chinese medicine had used ma huang to treat respiratory ailments, to reduce fever, to stimulate the body's vital energies. Nagai wanted to understand why. He wanted to isolate the active compound responsible for the plant's effects. In 1885, he succeeded. From the ma huang plant, Nagai extracted and identified ephedra, a stimulant alkaloid that acts on the central nervous system. It was elegant work, the kind of careful chemical detective story that defined pharmaceutical research in that era. But Nagai didn't stop there. He continued to experiment with ephedra, manipulating its molecular structure, seeing what else might be possible. In 1893, he synthesized something new. Through a process of reduction, removing an oxygen atom from the ephedrine molecule, Nagai created methamphetamine, N-methyl-1-phenylpropane-2-amine, a compound slightly simpler than its parent molecule, but with profoundly different effects on human physiology. He published his findings in the scientific literature. He moved on to other projects. The molecule sat in the pages of academic journals, a footnote in the ongoing story of pharmaceutical chemistry. For more than 2 decades, methamphetamine remained largely a laboratory curiosity. Other stimulants were more readily available, easier to produce, better understood. Cocaine had been isolated from coca leaves in 1859 and was widely used in medicines and tonics. Caffeine had been known for centuries. The world had no particular need for this new compound. Then came 1919. A Japanese chemist named Akita Ogata, working in the same tradition as Nagai, refined the synthesis process. Using a different method involving red phosphorus and iodine to reduce ephedrine, Ogata created crystalline methamphetamine hydrochloride. This crystalline form was more stable, or potent, and crucially, far easier to produce in quantity and to administer. It could be dissolved in water, it could be formed into tablets. It had crossed the threshold from laboratory specimen to potential pharmaceutical product. This is important to understand. There was no malice in these discoveries, no sinister plot. Nagai and Ogata were scientists doing what scientists do. exploring the properties of matter, expanding the catalog of known compounds. The early 20th century was an era of pharmaceutical optimism. Morphine was prescribed freely for pain. Cocaine was an ingredient in popular beverages and patent medicines. Heroin was marketed by the Bayer Company as a non-addictive cough suppressant. The modern framework for understanding addiction, for recognizing the dangers of psychoactive substances, simply did not exist. Chemistry is indifferent. A molecule has no morality, no agenda, no consciousness of the role it will play in human affairs. Methamphetamine in 1919 was simply a compound with interesting properties: increased alertness, reduced fatigue, suppressed appetite, elevated mood. Those properties could be medicinal, they could be recreational, they could be military. The world would soon discover just how versatile this molecule could be, and how terrible. For 2 decades, methamphetamine remained an obscure chemical, a laboratory curiosity. Then came the 1930s, and everything changed. In 1937, the German pharmaceutical company Temmler-Werke began marketing methamphetamine under the brand name Pervitin. It was sold over the counter, no prescription required, advertised as a remedy for depression, a treatment for fatigue, a way to enhance productivity and mental clarity. Students took it to study through the night. Factory workers took it to endure long shifts. Housewives took it to manage the endless demands of domestic life. There were even chocolates laced with methamphetamine, marketed as Panzerschokolade for soldiers and Hausfrauener-Schokolade, housewives' chocolate, for civilians. The drug was presented as modern, scientific, a chemical solution to the challenges of contemporary life. Germany in the late 1930s was a nation preparing for war. The Nazi regime, having consolidated power and begun its systematic persecution of Jews, communists, homosexuals, and anyone deemed undesirable, now turned its attention to military expansion. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 marked the beginning of what would become the most devastating conflict in human history, and methamphetamine would be there, woven into the fabric of the German war machine. The Wehrmacht, the unified armed forces of Nazi Germany, discovered Pervitin's military potential almost immediately. Soldiers could march longer, tank crews could operate for days without sleep, pilots could fly missions that would have been physiologically impossible under normal human limitations. The drug didn't just enhance performance, it fundamentally altered what the German military could accomplish. In the spring of 1940, Germany launched its invasion of Western Europe. The Blitzkrieg, Lightning War, a strategy of overwhelming speed and aggression that would shatter the French defensive lines and force the surrender of France in just 6 weeks. History often attributes this success to German tactical innovation, to the use of concentrated armor and close air support, to the failures of French military leadership. All of this is true, but there is another factor, one less often discussed. Between April and July of 1940, the German military distributed more than 35 million tablets of Pervitin to its forces. 35 million. The drug was issued as standard equipment, packaged in small metal tubes with instructions for dosing. Soldiers were told to take 1 tablet to maintain alertness, 2 for extended operations, 3 for extreme circumstances. Tank commanders stayed awake for 3, sometimes 4 days straight, guiding their vehicles across hundreds of miles of enemy territory without rest. Infantry units marched through day and night, covering distances that should have required rest periods but didn't, because the men simply didn't need to sleep. This was not mere enhancement. This was the pharmacological rewiring of human endurance. The Blitzkrieg was in part a methamphetamine-fueled fever dream, a military campaign made possible by a chemical compound that allowed men to operate beyond the normal boundaries of human physiology. The drug reached the highest levels of the Nazi hierarchy. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's most powerful subordinates, became addicted to a combination of morphine and methamphetamine. His erratic behavior, his increasingly poor decision-making, his physical and mental deterioration in the later years of the war, all of this can be traced in part to his dependence on these substances. And then there was Hitler himself. Beginning in 1941, Adolf Hitler received daily injections from his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell. The contents of these injections varied, a pharmaceutical cocktail that included vitamins, hormones, and a preparation Morell called Vitamoltin. We know now that Vitamoltin contained methamphetamine. For the last 4 years of his life, as he directed a war that would claim tens of millions of lives, as he oversaw the industrial genocide of the Holocaust, Adolf Hitler was, by any reasonable definition, a methamphetamine addict. The irony is almost too bitter to articulate. The Nazi ideology rested on claims of racial purity, of Aryan superiority, of the natural dominance of the German people. Yet the military might of the Third Reich, its early successes, its seemingly superhuman capacity for aggression and endurance, was built on a foundation of chemical dependence. The master race required drugs to achieve its victories. But chemistry is indifferent to ideology, and the human body has limits that no drug can permanently overcome. By 1940, reports began filtering back from the front lines, soldiers experiencing severe psychosis, paranoid delusions, hallucinations, heart attacks among young, otherwise healthy men, cardiovascular collapse. The crash that inevitably followed the high left soldiers incapacitated, unable to function, sometimes catatonic with exhaustion. Military physicians began documenting what they called Pervitin damages. The drug that had seemed like a miracle was revealing itself as a curse. Addiction developed rapidly. Soldiers who had been issued Pervitin as part of their standard equipment now couldn't function without it. Tolerance built quickly, requiring ever higher doses to achieve the same effects. And the side effects intensified: aggression, violence, psychotic breaks that rendered men dangerous to themselves and to their comrades. In 1940, the German military command issued restrictions on Pervitin distribution. It was to be used only in extreme circumstances, only with officer approval, only when absolutely necessary. But by then, the damage was done. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers had been exposed to methamphetamine. Many were addicted. The drug continued to circulate, obtained through unofficial channels, hoarded, traded, consumed in secret when official supplies were denied. As the war turned against Germany, as the Eastern Front devolved into a meat grinder of unprecedented horror, as the bombing of German cities intensified and the Allied forces closed in from all sides, methamphetamine use became increasingly desperate. Soldiers took it not to achieve victory, but simply to endure, to survive another day in frozen trenches, to keep fighting when every rational calculation suggested surrender, to stave off the psychological collapse that came from witnessing and participating in atrocities beyond human comprehension. The Third Reich fell in May 1945, defeated by the combined forces of the Allied powers, brought down by its own genocidal madness and strategic overreach. Among the ruins of German cities, among the emaciated survivors of concentration camps, among the millions of displaced persons wandering across a devastated continent, there were also the addicted, soldiers and civilians alike, their bodies and minds shaped by years of methamphetamine use, now facing a world without access to the drug that had sustained them. The Nazis had weaponized methamphetamine. They had turned a pharmaceutical compound into a tool of conquest. And in doing so, they had demonstrated something terrible and true about the 20th century, that modern warfare would increasingly rely not just on superior technology or tactics, but on the chemical manipulation of human consciousness, that the boundaries of human endurance could be pushed far beyond their natural limits, and that nations would be willing to sacrifice the long-term health of their own populations in pursuit of short-term military advantage. Pervitin had promised to make supermen. Instead, it had made addicts, it had made psychotics, it had made ghosts. The war was over, but the drug remained, and its story was far from finished. But Germany wasn't alone. On the other side of the world, another empire was waging a pharmaceutical war of its own. Japan, the birthplace of methamphetamine, had been watching the molecule's journey with great interest. While Nagayoshi and Akira Ogata had synthesized the compound in the pursuit of pure science, the Japanese military and pharmaceutical industry recognized its potential for something far more immediate. In the early 1940s, as Japan expanded its empire across Asia and the Pacific, methamphetamine was marketed under a new name, Philippon, from the Greek Philipponos, meaning love of work. The name was apt. Philippon was distributed widely to factory workers laboring 12, 14, 16-hour shifts in munitions plants and shipyards. Japan's war economy demanded total mobilization, every resource bent toward the machinery of conquest. Workers took Philippon to meet impossible production quotas, to keep their hands moving when their bodies screamed for rest, to contribute to the empire's expansion, even as exhaustion threatened to break them. Soldiers received it too. The Japanese military, fighting across vast distances from the jungles of Southeast Asia to the remote islands of the Pacific, needed men who could endure tropical diseases, scarce rations, and the psychological weight of a war that was increasingly unwinnable. Philippon provided temporary relief from all of it: energy when there was no food, alertness when there was no sleep, a chemical shield against the awareness of their own mortality. But the most haunting application of methamphetamine in Imperial Japan was reserved for a special group, the kamikaze pilots. The word kamikaze means divine wind, a reference to the typhoons that had twice saved Japan from Mongol invasion in the 13th century. By 1944, as American forces pushed closer to the Japanese homeland, as conventional military tactics failed to stem the tide of Allied advance, the Japanese High Command embraced a desperate strategy: suicide attacks. Pilots would load their aircraft with explosives and fly directly into American ships, sacrificing their lives to inflict maximum damage on the enemy. These pilots were young. Most were between 17 and 22 years old. They were students pulled from universities, boys given a few weeks of flight training, just enough to take off and point their aircraft at a target. They were told they were heroes. They were told their deaths would be glorious, that they would be enshrined as gods, that their sacrifice would save the empire and protect their families. The cultural and political coercion that created the kamikaze program cannot be overstated. These young men lived in a society where obedience to authority was absolute, where the emperor was divine, where the concept of individual will was subordinated entirely to collective duty. Many wrote farewell letters to their families, letters that speak of resignation, of honor, of a willingness to die that was often more about social pressure than genuine conviction. And they were given Philippon. The drug didn't create their sacrifice. It didn't manufacture their willingness to die. That was the product of propaganda, of militaristic indoctrination, of a society that had lost its moral compass in the pursuit of empire. But the methamphetamine made the unbearable bearable. It suppressed the terror. It overrode the survival instinct that every human being possesses, the instinct that screams at you to turn away from certain death. It allowed these young men to climb into their cockpits, to take off, to point their aircraft at American destroyers and carriers, and to hold course as anti-aircraft fire filled the sky around them. They were children, and we gave them pills and told them to die. The kamikaze attacks inflicted significant damage on Allied forces. Nearly 5,000 American sailors were killed by suicide strikes, and dozens of ships were sunk or severely damaged. But the strategic impact was limited. The attacks didn't change the trajectory of the war. They didn't save the empire. They simply added thousands more young lives to the already incomprehensible death toll of World War II. When the war ended in August 1945, with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the subsequent Japanese surrender, the fighting stopped. The empire collapsed. The militarists who had led Japan into catastrophe were removed from power. Some tried for war crimes, others simply fading into the devastation of the post-war landscape. But there was a problem. Japan's pharmaceutical companies had been producing Philippon at industrial scale to supply the military. Enormous stockpiles of methamphetamine, intended for soldiers and factory workers and kamikaze pilots who would no longer need them, now sat in warehouses and storage facilities across the country. The occupying American forces didn't know what to do with it. There was no framework for disposing of such quantities of a drug that most people still viewed as relatively harmless. And so the stockpiles were released into the civilian market. Drugstores began selling Philippon openly, no questions asked, no prescriptions required. A war-traumatized population facing economic devastation, food shortages, the psychological weight of defeat, and the knowledge of the atomic bombings suddenly had easy access to a powerful stimulant that promised energy, focus, relief from despair. When the war ended, the fighting stopped, but the drugs didn't. While Japan struggled to contain its creation, methamphetamine was finding new markets and a new name across the Pacific. But before it crossed the ocean, it would devastate the nation that invented it. The war ended in August 1945 with 2 atomic blasts and unconditional surrender. Japan was shattered. Its cities were rubble. Its economy was in ruins. Its people were traumatized, hungry, and desperate. An estimated 3 million Japanese had died in the conflict. Millions more had lost
Everything. The social fabric that had held the nation together for centuries was torn apart. And in the midst of this devastation, the military stockpiles remained. Tons of methamphetamine, stored in warehouses across the country. Philippon, Hiropon, Cedrin, the drugs that had powered kamikaze pilots and factory workers during the war. The military had no use for them now, so they did what seemed logical at the time. They released them to the civilian market. By 1946, Philippon was being sold openly in drugstores across Japan, not as a controlled substance, not as a prescription medication, but as an over-the-counter remedy, a productivity aid. The marketing was remarkably similar to the wartime propaganda. Work longer, study harder, overcome exhaustion, rebuild the nation. and the Japanese people, exhausted and desperate, believed it. Laborers used it to work 16-hour shifts in the rubble, clearing debris and constructing new buildings from the ruins. Students used it to study through the night, preparing for exams in a society where education was seen as the only path to survival. Mothers used it to care for their families while working multiple jobs. The drug that had been a tool of military aggression became a tool of survival in peacetime. The numbers grew quickly. By 1950, an estimated 500,000 Japanese were regular users. By 1951, the figure had doubled. By 1954, it reached approximately 2 million people. That's roughly 5% of Japan's entire population, habitual methamphetamine users, in a single decade. This was the first large-scale civilian methamphetamine epidemic in human history, and no one knew how to stop it. The Yakuza, Japan's organized crime syndicates, saw the opportunity immediately. They seized control of distribution networks, moving Philippon from legitimate drugstores into the black market as the government began to recognize the crisis. They organized production, they controlled supply chains, they expanded markets. The foundation of organized methamphetamine trafficking was being laid in the ruins of post-war Japan. And then the consequences began to manifest. Hospitals reported a surge in cases of stimulant-induced psychosis, users experiencing paranoid delusions, hallucinations, violent outbursts. The drug that promised productivity delivered madness. Families disintegrated. Crime rates spiked. In 1954 alone, Japanese authorities made over 550,000 arrests related to stimulant use and possession. More than 500,000 arrests in a single year. For context, that's more than the entire population of Osaka at the time. The Japanese government, which had created and distributed the drug, now faced a public health catastrophe of its own making. In 1951, the Diet passed the Stimulant Control Law, Japan's first major prohibition on methamphetamine. The law was comprehensive. It criminalized unauthorized production, distribution, and possession. But unlike many drug policies that would follow around the world, Japan's approach was multifaceted. Criminalization, yes, but also treatment, public education campaigns, social mobilization. The government acknowledged the problem, accepted responsibility, and committed resources to solving it. The crackdown was severe. Police raids targeted Yakuza operations. Users were arrested, but many were also offered treatment rather than just incarceration. Public health officials launched education campaigns explaining the dangers of stimulant abuse. Employers were encouraged to provide support for workers trying to quit. Communities organized intervention programs. It worked, slowly, painfully, but measurably. By 1958, methamphetamine use in Japan had dramatically dropped. The epidemic that had consumed 5% of the population was largely contained. Usage rates fell below 1%. Arrests declined. Hospitals reported fewer psychosis cases. Japan had confronted its first drug epidemic and emerged on the other side. But context matters deeply here. Japan in the 1950s was a small island nation with strong cultural cohesion, a population mobilized by post-war Reconstruction energy, and a government willing to invest heavily in both enforcement and treatment. The conditions that allowed Japan to contain its epidemic were unique. They would not be replicated elsewhere. And the chemical itself did not disappear. It couldn't. The knowledge of how to synthesize methamphetamine was now part of human history. The demand for its effects, energy, focus, euphoria, escape, was universal. So the drug did what drugs always do when suppressed in one location. It migrated. While Japan struggled to contain its creation, methamphetamine was finding new markets and a new name across the Pacific. But by the mid-1960s, the cracks were starting to show, and a new generation was about to discover methamphetamine's darker possibilities. To understand how we arrived at that moment, we need to step back in time, back to an era when methamphetamine wasn't a street drug.
Or a social crisis. It was medicine. In the 1930s, American pharmaceutical companies saw enormous potential in methamphetamine. The chemical had been synthesized in Japan, but American capitalism would perfect its distribution. In 1938, SmithKline & French, one of the largest pharmaceutical firms in the United States, began marketing methamphetamine under the brand name Dexedrine. By the early 1940s, they introduced Desoxin, a pure methamphetamine formulation. Other companies followed with their own brands, Methadrine, Syndrox, Obetrol. These weren't experimental drugs.
They were FDA-approved medications with a growing list of legitimate indications: depression, narcolepsy, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in children, chronic fatigue, and perhaps most profitably, obesity. Methamphetamine was marketed as an appetite suppressant, a miracle solution for weight loss. The medical establishment embraced it. Doctors prescribed it freely, pharmacies stocked it prominently, patients requested it by name. This was the pre-controlled substances era. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 had established FDA oversight, but the regulatory framework was far more permissive than what would come later. There was no Drug Enforcement Administration, no Controlled Substances Act, no cultural panic about addiction. Methamphetamine was simply another tool in the physician's arsenal, and it seemed to work. The drug delivered what it promised. Patients lost weight. Children with attention problems focused better in school. People suffering from depression reported elevated mood and increased energy. Narcoleptics stayed awake. The side effects were noted but minimized: insomnia, nervousness, dry mouth. Nothing that seemed to outweigh the benefits. By the 1950s, methamphetamine had become deeply embedded in American life. Housewives across suburban America were prescribed diet pills containing methamphetamine. These were the mother's little helpers of the Eisenhower era, though that term would later be associated with Valium. The marketing was targeted, deliberate, and extraordinarily effective. Magazine advertisements showed smiling women in aprons, slim and energetic, thanks to their doctor-prescribed weight loss medication. The message was clear: modern medicine could help you achieve the ideal feminine form. The fact that the active ingredient was literally methamphetamine was mentioned in fine print, if at all. Millions of American women took these pills, not occasionally, daily, for months or years. Truck drivers used methamphetamine to stay awake during cross-country hauls. The long-haul trucking industry, expanding rapidly in post-war America as the interstate highway system was constructed, relied on drivers who could push through exhaustion. Bennies, they called them, short for benzodrine, an amphetamine compound that was methamphetamine's chemical cousin. Pop a few pills and you could drive through the night without stopping. College students discovered that methamphetamine could compress study time. An exam in the morning, take a pill at midnight and study until dawn. The drug was seen as a performance enhancer, no different than coffee, just more effective. Universities didn't ban it, parents didn't object. It was medicine. The Beat Generation, that loose collective of writers and artists who rejected post-war conformity in the 1950s, embraced amphetamines as creative fuel. Jack Kerouac famously typed the first draft of On the Road in 3 weeks on a continuous scroll of paper, fueled by benzodrine and coffee. William S. Burroughs wrote extensively about his amphetamine use. Allen Ginsberg experimented with it. These weren't cautionary tales at the time. They were cultural badges of artistic intensity. The American military, like the Japanese and Germans before them, recognized methamphetamine's tactical utility. During the Korean War in the early 1950s, U.S. soldiers were issued amphetamines to maintain alertness during prolonged combat operations. The practice continued into the early years of the Vietnam War. The Pentagon saw it as a force multiplier, a way to extend human endurance beyond its natural limits. Everyone, it seemed, had a legitimate use for methamphetamine. The medical literature of the era reflects a stunning confidence in the drug's safety profile. Journal articles described methamphetamine as non-habit forming when used as prescribed. Addiction, the medical establishment believed, was a problem of abuse, not of the substance itself. If a patient followed their doctor's instructions, took the prescribed dose, and didn't exceed recommendations, there was no danger. This wasn't recklessness, it was the prevailing scientific consensus. By the mid-1960s, American pharmaceutical companies were producing billions of doses of methamphetamine and related amphetamines annually. Prescriptions peaked during this period. An estimated 8 to 10% of the American population had used
prescription amphetamines or methamphetamine at some point. That's roughly 15 to 20 million people. The drug was everywhere, in medicine cabinets, in purses, in truck stops, in dorm rooms, in military supply kits. It was normalized, medicalized, and thoroughly integrated into American culture. The idea that methamphetamine could be dangerous seemed absurd. It was approved by the FDA, prescribed by doctors, manufactured by reputable pharmaceutical companies, advertised in women's magazines. What could possibly go wrong? But beneath this shiny surface of medical legitimacy, patterns were emerging, patterns that would take years to recognize and longer to acknowledge. Some patients found they needed higher doses to achieve the same effects, tolerance. Others found that stopping the medication abruptly left them exhausted, depressed, unable to function, dependence. Emergency rooms began seeing cases of amphetamine-induced psychoses, though these were dismissed as rare aberrations. The medical establishment had created a massive population of methamphetamine users, legal users, medically sanctioned users, and the drug, as it always does, was beginning to assert its own logic. But by the mid-1960s, the cracks were starting to show, and a new generation was about to discover methamphetamine's darker possibilities. As America criminalized methamphetamine, it didn't disappear, it went underground, and in that darkness it evolved. But before that transformation was complete, there was a brief, chaotic moment when the counterculture tried to save itself from a drug it couldn't control. The mid-1960s in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district represented something unprecedented in American history. Young people by the thousands converged on a few square blocks, rejecting the values of their parents' generation. They called it the Summer of Love. They believed in peace, communal living, expanded consciousness. LSD was the sacrament. Marijuana was ubiquitous. The Grateful Dead played free concerts in Golden Gate Park. The Diggers distributed free food. Timothy Leary told everyone to turn on, tune in, drop out. It was messy, idealistic, and profoundly optimistic. For a brief moment, it seemed like a genuine alternative culture might actually take root. Then, methamphetamine arrived. It didn't come as Desoxyn in a prescription bottle. It came as speed, injectable methamphetamine hydroxide sold in makeshift packets by street dealers. It was cheap, it was intense, and it was utterly incompatible with the psychedelic philosophy that defined the hate. LSD promised ego dissolution and mystical insight. Marijuana offered gentle euphoria and philosophical wandering. But methamphetamine delivered something else entirely. Aggressive energy, paranoid hypervigilance, a jittery, compulsive intensity that burned through the user's nervous system like acid through metal. Where psychedelics expanded consciousness, speed narrowed it. Where marijuana encouraged contemplation, methamphetamine demanded action, repetitive, meaningless action. The speed freaks were impossible to miss. They moved differently, talked differently, their eyes were wide and empty, they picked at their skin, they paced endlessly, they couldn't sit through a concert or a conversation. They'd take apart a motorcycle engine and never reassemble it, fixating on a single bolt for hours. They'd talk in rapid, disjointed monologues about conspiracies and paranoid fantasies. And they were aggressive, violent sometimes. The gentle vibe of the Haight-Ashbury scene began to fracture. Fights broke out, thefts increased. Women reported assaults by speed-addled men who had been awake for days. The communal houses that had welcomed anyone with open doors now locked them. Trust evaporated. By 1967, the counterculture itself recognized that methamphetamine was destroying everything they'd tried to build. This wasn't the establishment talking. This was the hippies, the freaks, the dropouts, the people who'd rejected every conventional authority, now policing themselves. The Speed Kills posters began appearing on telephone poles, in coffee shops, on the walls of crash pads throughout the Haight. Stark, hand-printed warnings, skull and crossbones imagery, blunt language, speed kills your mind, speed kills your body, speed kills the scene. It was community self-defense, an attempt to expel the poison before it metastasized. Frank Zappa, never one to romanticize drug culture, put it perfectly in 1968. Speed will turn you into your parents, the ultimate insult in a movement built on generational rebellion. The implication was clear. Methamphetamine didn't liberate consciousness. It replicated the grinding, compulsive, joyless work ethic of the very culture the hippies were trying to escape. Even the Grateful Dead, who were hardly anti-drug, warned their community away from speed. The message was consistent across the counterculture. Methamphetamine was different, dangerous, incompatible with the values they espoused. But it was too late. Demand had already taken root. The outlaw motorcycle gangs, particularly the Hells Angels, saw the opportunity immediately. They had been on the periphery of the hate scene, providing security at concerts, living by their own code. But they were businessmen too, in their way, and methamphetamine was a profitable business. The Hells Angels and other biker clubs began manufacturing methamphetamine in makeshift underground laboratories. These weren't sophisticated operations. Dangerous chemistry performed in warehouses, barns, trailers. The process was volatile. Labs exploded regularly. But the profit margins were extraordinary. A few $100s in precursor chemicals could yield thousands in product. The biker gangs didn't limit their distribution to the Haight.
They expanded networks across California, then across the West. They sold to truck drivers, to laborers, to anyone who wanted to stay awake and work harder. The drug that had been rejected by the counterculture found eager markets elsewhere. Meanwhile, the federal government was watching. The explosion of illicit drug use in the 1960s, marijuana, LSD, heroin, and now methamphetamine, had become a political crisis. President Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number one. Congress prepared sweeping legislation. In 1970, the Controlled Substances Act became law. It established 5 schedules of controlled substances based on medical utility and abuse potential. Methamphetamine was classified as Schedule 2, high potential for abuse, severe psychological or physical dependence, but some accepted medical use. Disoxin remained FDA approved for severe ADHD and obesity, but prescriptions became tightly controlled. The era of casual prescription methamphetamine was over. Doctors who'd freely written prescriptions for diet pills now faced scrutiny. Pharmacies couldn't stock methamphetamine without special licensing. Patients who'd relied on prescription speed found their supply cut off. Some transitioned to other medications, some quit, and some turned to the black market. The irony was profound. The same pharmaceutical companies that had marketed methamphetamine to millions of Americans in glossy magazine advertisements were now absolved of responsibility. The drug they'd promoted as safe and non-addictive was suddenly a Schedule II controlled substance, but the companies faced no consequences, no liability, no reckoning. The users, though, they became criminals. Possession of methamphetamine, which had been legal with a prescription just months earlier, was now a crime. The housewives who'd taken diet pills, the truck drivers who'd stayed awake with bennies, the students who'd crammed for exams, if they continued using, they were now drug offenders. The Controlled Substances Act didn't eliminate methamphetamine use. It simply moved it from the regulated pharmaceutical industry to the unregulated criminal underground. The quality control vanished, the purity became unpredictable, the risk multiplied. And the biker gangs, already positioned to meet demand, scaled up production. By 1971, law enforcement agencies across the western United States were reporting a surge in clandestine methamphetamine labs. The drug had been driven underground, and in that darkness, away from oversight and regulation, it would become something far more dangerous than the pharmaceutical companies had ever imagined. The counterculture had tried to reject methamphetamine. The government had tried to control it. Both failed because the demand remained, and where there is demand, someone will supply it. As America criminalized methamphetamine, it didn't disappear. It went underground, and in that darkness, it evolved. But in the 1980s, everything was about to change. A new method, a new scale, and a new nightmare. Before that transformation, though, methamphetamine belonged to the outlaws, the bikers, the men who wore leather cuts with club patches and lived by codes older than the laws they broke. The 1970s marked the beginning of what would later be called the biker crank era, crank. The word itself came from the practice of hiding methamphetamine in motorcycle crankcases during transport. Hollow out the crankcase, stuff it with product, seal it up, and ride across state lines. Law enforcement rarely thought to check there. It was crude, effective, and quintessentially biker. The outlaw motorcycle gangs, the Hells Angels, the Outlaws, the Banditos, the Pagans, had found their enterprise. Methamphetamine wasn't their only business. They ran guns, extorted protection money, trafficked other drugs. But crank was different. It was domestically produced, the profit margins were absurd, and the market was reliable. The Hells Angels were the most prominent players, particularly in California and the Pacific Northwest. Their chapters operated semi-independently, but information and infrastructure flowed through the
network. A member in Oakland might know a chemist. A chapter in Spokane might control precursor supply lines. A clubhouse in San Bernardino might serve as a distribution hub. It was decentralized but coordinated, organic criminal organization. The labs themselves were primitive by later standards. Trailer homes parked on remote rural properties, warehouses in industrial zones where no one asked questions, barns on foreclosed farms. The chemistry was dangerous, performed by self-taught cooks who'd learned the recipe from other bikers or from underground manuals circulating through the subculture. They used the P2P method, phenyl-2-propanone synthesis, which required precursor chemicals that were still relatively easy to obtain in the 1970s. When those became harder to access, they adopted. Anhydrous ammonia, stolen from agricultural supply depots and farms, became a key ingredient. Farmers would wake up to find their tanks drained, hoses abandoned in the dirt. The labs were volatile, explosions were common. A miscalculation, an overheated reaction, a spark near flammable solvents, and the entire operation would detonate. Trailers would be found scorched and collapsed, bodies inside burned beyond recognition. Toxic waste was dumped wherever convenient: creeks, vacant lots, roadside ditches. The environmental damage was invisible at the time, a problem for later generations. But the product moved, and it made money. The user base in this era was distinct: blue-collar workers who needed to push through double shifts, long-haul truckers driving across the country on tight deadlines, construction crews, loggers, oil rig workers. These weren't recreational users seeking a high. They were people using methamphetamine functionally, the same way pharmaceutical companies had marketed it a decade earlier: stay awake, work harder, make the rent. The bikers themselves used it, of course. It fit the lifestyle: the long rides, the late nights, the violent confrontations that required aggressive energy. Methamphetamine was performance enhancement for an outlaw existence. Geographically, the problem was concentrated: rural West, the Southwest, pockets of the Midwest where biker clubs had established territory. This wasn't yet a national crisis. It was regional, subcultural, relatively contained. In major urban centers on the East Coast, methamphetamine was barely present. Cocaine and heroin dominated those markets. Law enforcement in the 1970s and early 80s was largely unprepared for organized methamphetamine production. Local sheriffs would occasionally stumble upon a lab during a routine call. A tip would lead to a bust. A trailer would explode, and investigators would find evidence of drug manufacturing. But there was no coordinated federal response, no task forces, no specialized training. The Drug Enforcement Agency, created in 1973, was focused on heroin and cocaine trafficking, particularly from Latin America. Methamphetamine, made domestically by bikers in rural areas, didn't register as a priority. The infrastructure to combat it didn't exist yet. And so the outlaw motorcycle gangs operated with relative impunity. They weren't invisible. Law enforcement knew who they were, but proving manufacturing and distribution in court was difficult. The labs were mobile, abandoned after a few production runs. The gang structure insulated higher-ranking members from direct involvement. Arrests happened, but they were scattered, local, insufficient to disrupt the networks. There was a dark romance to it in retrospect, the outlaw mystique. Decades later, television shows like Sons of Anarchy would mythologize this era, portraying biker gangs as anti-establishment rebels with their own code of honor. The reality was grimmer. These were criminal organizations engaged in violence, intimidation, and the distribution of a drug that destroyed lives. But compared to what was coming, the biker crank era seems almost quaint. Production was small batch. A successful lab might produce a few pounds per cook. Distribution was measured in ounces, not tons. The scale was human, comprehensible. A biker chemist working in a trailer, a dealer selling to truckers at a rest stop, a user picking up a baggie to get through the work week. It was artisanal in a criminal sense, decentralized, domestic, contained. But the chemistry was known, the demand was established, the market was proven. All it would take was someone to scale it up, to industrialize production, to flood the market with purity and volume that the biker labs could never match. That someone was coming, and the method they would use would change everything. But in the 1980s, everything was about to change. A new method, a new scale, and a new nightmare. As the meth crisis spiraled, America did what it always does. It declared a war. But wars on drugs don't end the drugs. They just decide who suffers. Before that war began in earnest, though, methamphetamine underwent a
transformation that would define it for a generation. It became industrial, mass-produced, ubiquitous. The early 1990s brought a chemical revolution that would democratize methamphetamine production in the most dangerous way possible. Chemists discovered that pseudoephedrine, the decongestant found in cold medicines like Sudafed, could be converted into methamphetamine using a relatively simple process. This method, sometimes called the Nazi method or Birch reduction, was far easier than the old P2P synthesis that biker gangs had relied on. You didn't need to be a trained chemist. You didn't need laboratory equipment. You needed cold medicine, lithium batteries, anhydrous ammonia, and a basic understanding of the recipe. Instructions circulated through prison networks, biker clubs, and eventually the early internet. By the mid-1990s, anyone with motivation and a few $100s could manufacture methamphetamine. Then came the shake and bake method, a one-pot synthesis performed in a 2-liter plastic bottle.
Mix the ingredients, shake periodically to activate the reaction, vent the gas buildup, and within hours you'd have crude methamphetamine. It was dangerous. The bottle could explode, burst into flames, release toxic gas, but it worked, and it required almost no specialized knowledge. Suddenly, methamphetamine labs were everywhere. Rural America became the epicenter. Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Iowa, the region that would become known as the meth belt. Trailer parks, farmhouses, abandoned buildings, motel rooms, garden sheds. The labs were small, mobile, and prolific. In 2003, Missouri alone reported over 2,700 lab seizures. That's more than 7 labs discovered every single day for an entire year in one state. The human cost was immediate and visible. Labs exploded regularly, burning down homes and killing or disfiguring the people inside. Children were present in approximately 30% of lab busts. Kids living in homes saturated with toxic fumes, surrounded by volatile chemicals, exposed to methamphetamine smoke. Emergency rooms treated children for chemical burns, respiratory damage, and methamphetamine poisoning. The environmental damage was staggering. For every pound of methamphetamine produced, approximately 5 to 6 pounds of toxic waste was generated. Contaminated solvents, caustic chemicals, heavy metals. This waste was dumped wherever convenient, into rivers and creeks, in forests and fields, buried in backyards, poured into storm drains. Entire properties became hazardous waste sites, uninhabitable, the soil poisoned for decades. Law enforcement was overwhelmed. Small-town sheriffs with limited budgets and no specialized training were suddenly confronting chemical manufacturing operations. Dismantling a meth lab required hazmat suits, proper ventilation equipment, and safe disposal procedures. Each bust cost thousands of dollars, and for every lab discovered, several more were operating undetected. But even as these small domestic labs proliferated across rural America, something far larger was taking shape across the border. The Mexican drug cartels had been watching, and they recognized an opportunity that would reshape the entire methamphetamine market. The Sinaloa cartel, already dominant in cocaine and marijuana trafficking, began investing in methamphetamine production in the mid-1990s. They didn't build trailer labs or shake-and-bake operations. They built super labs, industrial-scale facilities hidden in remote areas of Mexico, capable of producing hundreds of pounds of methamphetamine in a single batch. These weren't crude operations. They were sophisticated chemical manufacturing plants. Professional chemists, many with legitimate pharmaceutical training, oversaw production. The precursor chemicals were imported in bulk from Asia, particularly China and India, where pseudoephedrine and ephedrine were manufactured legally for global pharmaceutical markets. The cartels bought tons at a time. The superlabs operated with industrial efficiency, temperature-controlled reactors, quality control testing, streamlined production processes. A single superlab could produce more methamphetamine in 1 week than 1,000 shake-and-bake operations could make in a year. And the purity was extraordinary. Cartel methamphetamine regularly tested at 90 to 98% purity, compared to the 40 to 60% purity typical of domestic small batch production. Higher purity meant more potent effects, fewer impurities, and a better product from a user's perspective. The cartels had the production capacity, they had the smuggling infrastructure, and they had the distribution networks already in place from decades of cocaine trafficking. All they needed to do was add methamphetamine to the pipeline. The flood began around 2005 and accelerated rapidly. Methamphetamine produced in Mexican superlabs was smuggled across the border by the ton, hidden in vehicles, trucks, tunnels, even
submarines. It was cheaper than domestic meth, purer, and available in quantities that no biker gang or small-time cook could ever match. The domestic labs couldn't compete. Why risk building your own lab with all the danger and expense when you could buy cartel meth for less money and better quality? By 2010, the Drug Enforcement Administration estimated that Mexican cartels controlled approximately 90% of the methamphetamine supply in the United States. The market had been industrialized, and the consequences were catastrophic. Methamphetamine addiction rates soared. In 1992, approximately 350,000 Americans reported past-month methamphetamine use. By 2006, that number had tripled. Emergency room visits related to methamphetamine increased by over 400% between 1995 and 2005. Overdose deaths climbed steadily. The physical devastation became iconic. In 2004, the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office in Oregon launched the Faces of Meth campaign, displaying before and after booking photos of methamphetamine users. The images were shocking. Dramatic facial aging, severe acne and sores, tooth decay, sunken eyes, drastic weight loss. The photos went viral, reproduced in anti-drug campaigns across the country. The media seized on methamphetamine as a uniquely evil substance. News segments with apocalyptic framing, the worst drug crisis in American history, the drug that's destroying rural America, an epidemic that respects no boundaries. While the rhetoric was sensationalized, the underlying reality was grim. User demographics had shifted. Methamphetamine was no longer limited to bikers, truckers, and blue-collar workers. It spread across class, race, and geography. White suburban teenagers, urban professionals, stay-at-home parents, college students. The drug's appeal was universal: energy, focus, euphoria, weight loss. And it was cheap. A hit could cost as little as $5. Certain populations were devastated disproportionately. Native American reservations experienced some of the highest methamphetamine addiction rates in the country. The combination of poverty, geographic isolation, historical trauma, and limited access to treatment created conditions where methamphetamine use metastasized. Some tribal communities reported that over 40% of residents struggled with meth addiction. Congress responded with the Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act of 2005, part of the USA Patriot Act reauthorization. The law placed restrictions on the sale of pseudoephedrine. Cold medicines containing it were moved behind pharmacy counters. Purchasers had to show ID and sign a logbook. Purchase limits were imposed. The goal was to choke off the precursor supply for domestic labs. It worked, to a degree. Domestic lab seizures dropped dramatically. Missouri's lab busts fell from over 2,700 in 2003 to under 300 by 2010. Across the meth belt, small labs were dismantled or abandoned. The shake-and-bake era began to fade. But the legislation did nothing to address cartel production. Mexican superlabs didn't rely on American pharmacy shelves for pseudoephedrine. They imported industrial quantities directly from manufacturers overseas. The restrictions on domestic precursors simply eliminated the cartel's last remaining competition. The methamphetamine market became a near-total monopoly, and the cartels, recognizing their control, increased production even further. Prices dropped, purity remained high, availability became nearly universal. By 2010, methamphetamine was cheaper and more accessible than it had been at any point in history. The industrialization was complete. What had begun as a military stimulant, evolved through pharmaceutical marketing and biker production, had become a cartel-controlled commodity produced at a scale that resembled legitimate industry. Except the product destroyed lives and the profits fueled violence that would claim hundreds of thousands of victims on both sides of the border. America's methamphetamine epidemic had entered its darkest phase. The small-town labs were gone, but the drug was everywhere. Communities that had never seen methamphetamine were suddenly saturated. Treatment centers were overwhelmed. Foster care systems buckled under the number of children removed from addicted parents. Prisons filled with users and low-level dealers, while the cartel leadership remained untouchable. The system was collapsing under the weight of industrial-scale drug supply, and no one knew how to stop it. As the meth crisis spiraled, America did what it always does. It declared war. But wars on drugs don't end the drugs. They just decide who suffers. But even as prisons filled, the meth crisis was evolving again, into something faster, cheaper, and more deadly than ever before. Before we reach that next transformation, though, we need to understand what America chose to do with the people caught in the crisis it had helped create. The answer was simple, brutal, and devastatingly effective at destroying lives without solving the problem. America built cages, and it filled them. The 2000s marked the height of America's punitive response to methamphetamine. Federal mandatory minimum sentences, established in the 1980s for crack cocaine, were applied with equal ferocity to methamphetamine offenses. 5 grams of actual methamphetamine, roughly the weight of a nickel, triggered a mandatory 5-year federal prison sentence. 50 grams meant 10 years. No judicial discretion, no consideration of circumstances, just a scale, a calculation, and a cage. State laws were often harsher. 3 strikes provisions meant that a third drug offense, even nonviolent possession, could result in a life sentence. In states across the meth belt, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, Tennessee, prosecutors used these laws aggressively. People caught with personal use amounts of methamphetamine were charged as dealers.
Addicts were prosecuted as criminals rather than treated as patients. The numbers are staggering. Between 2000 and 2015, over 1.2 million people were arrested on federal and state methamphetamine charges. Not all were incarcerated, but hundreds of thousands were. By 2010, methamphetamine offenses accounted for nearly 1/4 of all drug-related federal prison sentences. State prisons in the meth belt had methamphetamine-related incarceration rates that exceeded 40% of their total populations. These weren't cartel leaders or super lab operators serving time. Those people rarely faced prosecution. These were users, low-level dealers, people selling to support their own addiction, parents, siblings, sons, and daughters. Consider the mechanics of how this unfolded. A woman in rural Oklahoma addicted to methamphetamine, caught with 6 grams in her car during a traffic stop. Mandatory minimum, 5 years federal prison. She has 2 children, ages 4 and 7. They go into foster care. She serves her sentence. No drug treatment is provided in prison. Budget cuts eliminated most rehabilitation programs. She's released after 5 years. She has a felony record. She can't get housing assistance. She can't get food stamps in many states. Employment is nearly impossible. Her children have been in the foster system for 5 years, traumatized, moved between homes. She's barred from many parenting rights. Within 6 months, she's using again. Within a year, she's arrested again. Back to prison. Her children remain in foster care, the damage compounding with each year. This wasn't an exception. This was the system working exactly as designed. The impact on families was catastrophic. Between 2000 and 2010, the number of children entering foster care due to parental methamphetamine use increased by over 300% in states like Iowa, Montana, and Oklahoma. Foster care systems already underfunded and overwhelmed buckled. Children were placed in emergency shelters, sometimes for months, waiting for available homes. The psychological damage, separation from parents, instability, institutional care created a generation of traumatized children who would carry those scars into adulthood. Native American communities experienced this destruction disproportionately. Tribal nations already struggling with poverty, unemployment, and historical trauma saw entire families swept into the criminal justice system. On some reservations, over 70% of inmates were incarcerated for methamphetamine-related offenses. The combination of federal jurisdiction over major crimes on tribal land and aggressive prosecution meant that Native Americans were incarcerated at rates far exceeding their proportion of methamphetamine users nationally. And yet, despite the harsh sentencing, methamphetamine use didn't decline. The cartels continued flooding the market, prices dropped, purity remained high. For every person imprisoned, 10 more were using. The cage is filled, but the crisis deepened. The recidivism rates told the story clearly. Approximately 75% of people incarcerated for methamphetamine offenses were rearrested within 5 years of release. Why? Because prison didn't address addiction. It warehoused addicts, then released them back into the same communities, with the same trauma, the same poverty, the same lack of opportunity, but now with felony records that closed off even the limited options they'd had before. The private prison industry recognized the opportunity. Companies like Corrections Corporation of America and GO Group expanded rapidly during the 2000s, building facilities in states with high methamphetamine incarceration rates. They lobbied state legislatures for tougher sentencing laws and against early release programs. Incarceration was profitable. Each prisoner represented a revenue stream. The cruelty had a business model. But here's where the hypocrisy becomes impossible to ignore. As the methamphetamine crisis ravaged poor, rural, predominantly white communities in the 2000s, the response was
criminalization, enforcement, imprisonment, zero tolerance. Then came the opioid epidemic. Beginning around 2010, prescription opioid abuse and heroin use exploded, particularly in suburban and middle-class white communities. The overdose deaths were staggering. Over 70,000 Americans died from opioid overdoses in 2017 alone, but the response was fundamentally different. The opioid crisis was framed as a public health emergency. Addiction was described as a disease, not a moral failing. Funding poured into treatment programs, naloxone distribution, harm reduction initiatives. Politicians called for compassion. Media coverage focused on the victims of addiction, honor students, athletes, people with promising futures destroyed by pills. Law enforcement was directed to focus on doctors and pharmaceutical companies, not users. The contrast was stark and morally obscene. Whose addiction deserved treatment? Whose deserved prison?
The answer correlated disturbingly well with class, geography, and how closely the victims resembled the people making policy decisions. Methamphetamine users, disproportionately poor, rural, less educated, more likely to be in the criminal justice system already, were criminals. Opioid users, disproportionately middle class, suburban, white-collar, with families who could afford lawyers, were victims of an epidemic. Both groups were suffering from addiction, both needed treatment, but only one was offered it. The data supports this disparity. Between 2010 and 2015, federal funding for opioid addiction treatment increased by over 900%. Funding for methamphetamine treatment increased by less than 50%, despite methamphetamine use remaining steady and in some regions increasing. The Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act of 2016 allocated billions for opioid treatment, but barely mentioned methamphetamine. The message was clear. Some lives were worth saving, others were worth caging. Meanwhile, the people incarcerated for methamphetamine offenses served their sentences in facilities that provided almost no rehabilitation. Budget cuts throughout the 2000s had eliminated most prison drug treatment programs. Counseling was minimal or non-existent. Education and job training programs were waitlisted for years. The infrastructure to actually address addiction was never built. The only investment was in cells. And so the cycle continued. Arrest, incarcerate, release, rearrest. Generations of families trapped in the revolving door between addiction and imprisonment. Communities depopulated as young adults disappeared into prisons. Children growing up visiting parents through glass partitions. The social fabric disintegrating. This wasn't drug policy, it was social abandonment dressed up as law and order, and it accomplished nothing except suffering. But even as prisons filled, the meth crisis was evolving again into something faster, cheaper, and more deadly than ever before. So how did we get here? How does a pharmaceutical curiosity become a century-long catastrophe? To understand that, we have to look at the patterns, the forces that repeat, no matter the substance. But first, you need to understand where we are right now, because the meth crisis didn't end, it metastasized. The 2010s brought a transformation that made everything before it seem preliminary. The Mexican cartels, having already achieved dominance over methamphetamine supply, perfected their craft. The super labs reached a level of sophistication that rivaled legitimate pharmaceutical manufacturing. The methamphetamine they produced was crystalline, translucent, and astonishingly pure. 90 to 98% purity became standard. This wasn't street drug quality, this was laboratory-grade precision. Crystal meth, the name itself became synonymous with the modern era of the drug. Clear shards that looked like broken glass or ice. The visual purity matched the chemical purity, and it was everywhere. The price collapsed to historic lows. In the early 2000s, a gram of methamphetamine might cost $50 to $100, depending on purity and location. By 2015, that same gram cost $20 to $30. By 2020, in some markets, it was as low as $10. Individual doses, enough to get high for hours, could be purchased for $5 or less. Methamphetamine became the cheapest intoxicant available, cheaper than alcohol, cheaper than marijuana, far cheaper than cocaine or heroin. The economic logic was simple. Industrial-scale production drove costs down. A superlab could produce 500 pounds of methamphetamine a single cook. The profit margins were obscene, even at low retail prices. The cartels didn't need to charge premium rates. Volume was the strategy. Flood the market, create ubiquity, make methamphetamine the default option for anyone seeking chemical escape. And it worked. Methamphetamine spread beyond its traditional geographic boundaries. The meth belt, those rural communities
in the Midwest and South that had been devastated in the 2000s remained affected. But now the drug appeared in cities that had been largely spared. Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, New York, Boston, Atlanta. No region was immune. Demographics shifted. Methamphetamine was no longer primarily a rural white drug. It affected all races, all classes, all communities. Urban professionals used it to work longer hours. College students used it to study and party. LGBTQ+ communities, particularly gay and bisexual men, experienced a surge in methamphetamine use tied to party and play culture, the combination of meth and sex. The drug's effects, heightened arousal, decreased inhibition, prolonged stamina, made it appealing in sexual contexts. But it also increased HIV transmission risk through prolonged, often unprotected sexual encounters and needle sharing. The West Coast homelessness crisis became inextricably linked to methamphetamine. In cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle, and Portland, where visible homelessness had reached epidemic levels, methamphetamine was pervasive among unhoused populations. Studies estimated that 60 to 80% of homeless individuals struggling with substance use were using methamphetamine. The drug's effects, paranoia, aggression, psychosis, contributed to the visible mental health crisis on city streets. The cycle was self-reinforcing. Homelessness increased vulnerability to addiction. Addiction made escaping homelessness nearly impossible. Then came the contamination. Around 2017, fentanyl began appearing in methamphetamine supplies. Fentanyl, the synthetic opioid 50 times more potent than heroin, had already devastated the opioid-using population. Now it was killing methamphetamine users who had no tolerance to opioids. The reasons for contamination varied: cross-contamination in labs, deliberate adulteration to increase addictiveness, careless handling. The result was the same. People who used methamphetamine expecting a stimulant high died from opioid overdose. Overdose deaths involving psychostimulants, primarily methamphetamine, skyrocketed. In 2011, approximately 47,000 Americans died from overdoses involving methamphetamine or other psychostimulants. By 2021, that number had reached over 32,000, a nearly seven-fold increase in a decade. For context, that's more than the total number of Americans who died in the entire Vietnam War every single year. But unlike the opioid crisis, which generated national media attention, policy conferences, and funding initiatives, the methamphetamine crisis remained largely invisible. There were no primetime specials, no celebrity advocates, no National Day of Awareness. The deaths mounted quietly, disproportionately affecting populations that society had already written off: the poor, the homeless, the incarcerated, the marginalized. Treatment remained woefully inadequate. For opioid addiction, medication-assisted treatment, methadone, buprenorphine, naltrexone, had proven effective. These medications reduced cravings, prevented withdrawal, and allowed people to stabilize their lives. But for methamphetamine addiction, no equivalent existed. There is still no FDA-approved medication that effectively treats meth dependence. Behavioral therapies, contingency management, cognitive behavioral therapy showed some effectiveness, but required intensive resources and long-term commitment, and they were available to only a fraction of the people who needed them. Most addiction treatment facilities were already overwhelmed by opioid cases. Methamphetamine users often faced waiting lists of months or were turned away entirely. The neurotoxicity of methamphetamine made recovery uniquely difficult. The drug causes significant damage to dopamine-producing neurons in the brain. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter associated with pleasure and reward, is depleted to catastrophic levels. Users in early recovery experience profound anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure, depression, cognitive impairment, executive function deficits. These effects can persist for months or years, making sustained abstinence extraordinarily difficult. As of 2021, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health estimated that approximately 1.6 million Americans aged 12 and older had used methamphetamine in the past year. Roughly 1 million met the criteria for methamphetamine use disorder, addiction. These numbers likely underestimate the true scale. Surveys don't reach incarcerated populations, homeless populations, or people who actively conceal their use. Right now, as you listen to this, methamphetamine is being manufactured in industrial quantities in Mexico. It's being smuggled across the border by the ton. It's being distributed through networks that span every state. It's being sold on street corners, through encrypted apps, in parking lots, and public restrooms. People are using it to work, to escape, to survive another day. And people are dying. The
crisis is ongoing, unresolved, largely ignored, and it shows no signs of slowing. So how did we get here? How does a pharmaceutical curiosity become a century-long catastrophe? To understand that, we have to look at the patterns, the forces that repeat, no matter the substance. And yet, even as the pattern reveals itself, the question remains, what do we do now? Before we can answer that, we need to see the pattern clearly. Because methamphetamine's century-long journey isn't unique, it's a blueprint. A cycle that repeats with numbing consistency across substances, across decades, across borders. The pattern has 7 stages, and it never varies. Stage 1. War. Conflict creates or distributes the drug. Methamphetamine was synthesized for military use, mass-produced by Nazi Germany, distributed to Japanese kamikaze pilots, issued to American soldiers in Korea and Vietnam. War normalizes the drug, proves its utility, and creates the initial population of users. Soldiers become test subjects. Entire nations become laboratories for chemical experimentation. When the war ends, the drug remains. The stockpiles don't disappear. They enter civilian markets. This happened with methamphetamine. It happened with morphine after the Civil War, creating America's first wave of opiate addiction among veterans. It happened with heroin,
originally marketed by Bayer as a non-addictive morphine substitute for soldiers with battlefield injuries. War always comes first. The drug is a tool. Then it becomes a problem. Stage 2. Medicine. The pharmaceutical industry recognizes profit potential and legitimizes the substance through medical marketing. Methamphetamine became Disoxin, FDA approved for depression, ADHD, obesity. Doctors prescribed it freely. Magazine advertisements showed smiling housewives and energetic children. The medical establishment provided cultural permission. If doctors recommend it, it must be safe. This is not unique to methamphetamine. Purdue Pharma did the same with OxyContin in the 1990s, assuring doctors that opiate addiction affected less than 1% of patients when prescribed for pain. Cocaine was sold in pharmacies as a remedy for toothaches and fatigue. Cannabis appeared in medical tinctures for menstrual cramps and insomnia. Medicine transforms a chemical into a commodity, and commodities generate profit. Stage 3. Crisis. Addiction spreads. Social harm becomes undeniable. The promises of safety collapse under the weight of reality. Families disintegrate. Emergency rooms overflow. Overdoses increase. The substance that was marketed as a solution becomes recognized as a catastrophe. For methamphetamine, this happened in post-war Japan, in 1960s Hydaspbury, in the 2000s meth belt. For opioids, it happened in the 2010s as prescription pills gave way to heroin and fentanyl. For crack cocaine, it happened in the 1980s as inner cities were devastated. The crisis is always predictable, and it is always ignored until it's too late. Stage 4. Prohibition. The government responds not with treatment infrastructure or harm reduction, but with criminalization. The substance is scheduled. Possession becomes a crime. Users become criminals. The focus shifts from public health to law enforcement. The 1970 Controlled Substances Act did this to methamphetamine. The 1914 Harrison Narcotics Act did it to opioids and cocaine. Prohibition doesn't eliminate demand. It simply drives the market underground and ensures that the people most harmed by the drug are further harmed by the legal system. Stage 5. Organized crime. Black markets don't operate themselves. Criminal organizations, cartels, gangs, syndicates recognize the opportunity and seize control of production and distribution. The Sinaloa cartel's super labs, the Hells Angels biker labs, the Medellin cartel's cocaine empire. Prohibition guarantees profit margins that no legal business could match. Violence becomes a market regulation tool. The drug war doesn't fight crime, it creates it, and then it arms it. Stage 6. Mass incarceration. Enforcement targets users and low-level dealers, disproportionately affecting the poor and marginalized. Mandatory minimums fill prisons. 3 strikes laws destroy lives. The people incarcerated are not cartel kingpins or super lob chemists. They're addicts. They're desperate people trying to survive. But they're also easy arrests. Quantifiable metrics for prosecutors and police departments. Over 1 million people incarcerated for methamphetamine offenses between 2000 and 2015. Millions more for crack cocaine in the 1980s and 1990s. Hundreds of thousands for heroin. The pattern is consistent. Criminalize the user, ignore the systemic causes, declare victory through body counts and cages. Stage 7. Profit. At every stage, someone profits. Pharmaceutical companies profit from legal sales during the medical legitimization phase. Organized crime profits from black market distribution during prohibition.
Prison industrial complex profits from mass incarceration. Politicians profit from tough-on-crime rhetoric. Law enforcement agencies profit from asset forfeiture and federal funding. The cycle is self-sustaining because it's profitable, not for users, not for communities, but for the industries and institutions that have built themselves around drug prohibition. Now ask yourself, is this incompetence? A century of repeating the same failed strategies, achieving the same catastrophic results, and never learning the lesson? Or is this design, a system functioning exactly as intended, generating profit and control at the expense of the populations deemed expendable? The evidence suggests the latter, because the pattern doesn't break by accident. It continues because powerful interests benefit from its continuation. Pharmaceutical companies are rarely held accountable for the addiction their products create. Cartels operate with impunity, sometimes with documented cooperation from intelligence agencies. Private prisons lobby for harsher sentencing, and the people who suffer, the users, the addicted, the incarcerated, the families, have no power to change the system. Methamphetamine's history is not an anomaly, it's the prototype. The same forces that shaped its journey from military stimulant to cartel commodity to mass incarceration crisis have shaped the trajectory of every prohibited substance in modern history. The names change, the chemicals change, but the pattern remains.
And yet, even as the pattern reveals itself, the question remains, what do we do now? Which brings us back to where we started, the molecule itself. What is methamphetamine, really, when you strip away a century of war, profit, and propaganda? Before we answer that, we need to confront what remains unfinished. Because the methamphetamine crisis isn't history, it's present tense, and thousands of people are still paying for choices America made decades ago. Right now, there are people in federal and state prisons serving sentences for methamphetamine offenses committed 10, 15, 20 years ago. Nonviolent possession, small-scale distribution to support their own addiction. Offenses that, in some states, would now result in probation or treatment, but they remain caged because mandatory minimums don't expire retroactively, because clemency requires political courage that few governors or presidents possess, because the system that incarcerated them has no mechanism for admitting it was wrong. There has been no mass clemency effort for methamphetamine offenders, no reckoning equivalent to the limited reforms applied to crack cocaine sentencing disparities. The First Step Act of 2018 provided modest sentencing reductions and retroactive relief for some federal drug offenses, but it excluded tens of thousands of people serving methamphetamine sentences. They wait, they age, and the years accumulate. The children who lost parents to prison in the 2000s are adults now. They grew up in foster care or with grandparents or in institutional settings. The trauma of separation compounded by the stigma of having an incarcerated parent. Studies show that children of incarcerated parents are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated themselves. The cycle perpetuates. Generational trauma remains unaddressed because addressing it would require acknowledging the harm the system inflicted. Outside the prisons, the treatment infrastructure remains devastatingly inadequate. If you're struggling with methamphetamine addiction and you seek help, here's what you'll likely encounter. Waiting lists that stretch for weeks or months. Programs that require upfront payment or insurance that many don't have. Facilities with limited beds unable to accommodate everyone who needs them. And even if you get in, the treatment options are limited. There is no FDA-approved medication for methamphetamine addiction. None. For opioid addiction, there's methadone, buprenorphine, naltrexone, medications that reduce cravings, block euphoric effects, and allow people to stabilize. They work, they save lives. But for methamphetamine, the pharmacological toolkit is empty. Behavioral therapies exist. Contingency management, which uses incentive-based rewards to encourage abstinence, shows genuine promise. Studies demonstrate that participants remain in treatment longer and achieve higher rates of sustained sobriety, but it's expensive, labor-intensive, and available in only a fraction of treatment centers. Cognitive behavioral therapy helps some people, but requires long-term commitment and skilled clinicians who are in short supply, and the relapse rates remain high. Not because people lack willpower or moral character, but because the neurological damage methamphetamine causes makes recovery extraordinarily difficult. The dopamine system, ravaged by chronic use, takes months or years to partially recover. Depression, anhedonia, cognitive impairment, these aren't temporary.
Withdrawal symptoms. They're lasting changes to brain chemistry. Meanwhile, harm reduction approaches that could save lives remain politically toxic. Safe injection sites, where people can use drugs under medical supervision, have been proven to reduce overdose deaths, connect users to treatment, and decrease public drug use. They exist in Canada, Europe, Australia, but in the United States, they face fierce opposition. Drug checking services, which allow users to test substances for dangerous contaminants like fentanyl, are similarly controversial despite clear evidence of effectiveness. Housing first models for homeless populations struggling with addiction, providing stable housing without requiring sobriety first, have shown remarkable success. Studies from cities that implemented these programs show significant reductions in emergency room visits, incarceration, and eventually substance use. But funding remains insufficient, and political will evaporates when communities object to housing formerly homeless addicts in their neighborhoods. The contrast in resource allocation is obscene. The Drug Enforcement Administration's budget for fiscal year 2023 was over $3.5 billion. Federal spending on drug interdiction, enforcement, and incarceration dwarfs spending on treatment and prevention by a factor of roughly 2 to 1. We spend billions arresting people and almost nothing helping them recover. Some states have begun softening sentencing. Oregon decriminalized personal possession of all drugs in 2020, redirecting resources towards treatment. The results have been mixed, largely because the promised treatment infrastructure was never adequately funded. Decriminalization without treatment isn't a solution. It's just a different form of abandonment. The political will for meaningful reform remains absent. Methamphetamine users face stigma that even opioid users, increasingly seen as victims of predatory pharmaceutical companies, have partially escaped. Meth users are still viewed as morally degenerate,
personally responsible for their destruction, unworthy of compassion or resources. This stigma is a choice, and it has consequences measured in lives. Let's be clear about the complexity here. Methamphetamine is genuinely harmful. It causes severe physical and psychological damage. Addiction is genuinely difficult to treat. Recovery is long, painful, and uncertain. These facts don't disappear through policy reform. But criminalization makes everything worse. It adds legal consequences to medical problems. It separates families. It creates criminal records that prevent employment, housing, stability. It fills prisons with people who need doctors. And it has utterly, catastrophically failed to reduce methamphetamine use. We have evidence now, decades of it. We know what doesn't work. We're learning what might work. But we lack the collective will to act on that knowledge. Which brings us back to where we started, the molecule itself. What is methamphetamine, really, when you strip away a century of war, profit, and propaganda? Let's return to where this began, to the molecule itself. C10, H15, N. 10 carbon atoms, 15 hydrogen atoms, 1 nitrogen atom, arranged in a specific configuration that interacts with the human nervous system in predictable ways. Methamphetamine is a dopamine releaser. It floods synopsis with neurotransmitters, creating intense euphoria, energy, focus. At high doses and with chronic use, it's neurotoxic. It damages dopamine-producing neurons. It's addictive. It causes harm. But it's not evil. It's not demonic. It's not a scourge or a plague or the worst drug ever created. It's chemistry. Just chemistry. The moral language we've draped over it for a century, that's ours. The molecule doesn't carry judgment. It simply exists. Strip away the propaganda, the fear, the century of projection, and what remains is a substance that humans synthesized, mass-produced, marketed, distributed, prohibited, and then punished other humans for using. The story of methamphetamine was never really about the drug. It was always about us, about what we're willing to do in war. Nazi Germany gave it to soldiers to fight longer. Japan gave it to kamikaze pilots to die without fear. America gave it to troops in Korea and Vietnam to stay awake. We deployed this molecule as a weapon, as a tool, as an enhancement to human capacity for violence. And when the wars ended, we acted surprised that it remained. About how we profit in peace. Pharmaceutical companies marketed methamphetamine to millions of Americans, housewives, children, truck drivers, students. The FDA approved it. Doctors prescribed it. Magazines advertised it. We made it legitimate, profitable, ubiquitous. And when the consequences emerged, the companies faced no reckoning. The users became criminals. About how we construct enemies. When methamphetamine was associated with bikers, it was an outlaw problem. When it devastated rural white communities, it was
a public health crisis, but one met with incarceration, not treatment. When Mexican cartels dominated production, it became a border security issue, a justification for militarized enforcement. The substance didn't change, our scapegoats did. About how we punish the vulnerable. Over 1 million people incarcerated for methamphetamine offenses, families destroyed, children taken, communities gutted. Not cartel leaders, not pharmaceutical executives, not the architects of the systems that created the crisis. Just users, just addicts, just people trying to survive or escape or feel something other than despair. Methamphetamine is a mirror, and what it reflects is a century of choices we've made as a society. Militarism that treats human bodies as machines to be chemically enhanced. Capitalism that monetizes suffering and calls it innovation. A criminal justice system that confuses punishment with solutions. A media apparatus that sensationalizes crises without examining causes. A political class that profits from fear and refuses accountability. The people are still there, in prisons serving sentences for offenses that harmed no one but themselves. On the streets, struggling with addiction in cities that criminalize homelessness and defund treatment. In rural communities, isolated and forgotten, where methamphetamine remains the only available escape from economic collapse. In morgues, overdose statistics that barely register in national consciousness. The crisis is unfinished, ongoing, and largely invisible to those with the power to change it. So the question becomes, can we learn from this? Can we look at a century of failure and choose a different path? Can we prioritize treatment over incarceration, harm reduction over moral judgment? systemic change over individual blame? Or are we doomed to repeat this pattern, to wait for the next substance, the next crisis, the next population to scapegoat? To watch the same cycle unfold: war, medicine, crisis, prohibition, profit, incarceration, and pretend we didn't see it coming? There are no easy answers here. The complexity demands humility. Methamphetamine addiction is genuinely destructive. Treatment is genuinely difficult. Some people will struggle for years and never achieve lasting sobriety. Recovery is not guaranteed, and policy cannot eliminate suffering. But inaction is also a choice. The status quo, mass incarceration, inadequate treatment, ongoing stigma, is not neutral. It is active harm. Every day we maintain this system, more people are arrested, more families are separated, more lives are foreclosed. The weight of that is ours to carry. We created this substance. We weaponized it in wars we chose to fight. We marketed it for profit. We criminalized the people harmed by our own systems. And we continue, even now, to prioritize punishment over healing, enforcement over compassion, political convenience over moral responsibility. The molecule doesn't care about any of this. It never did. It exists in laboratories and superlabs and evidence lockers, indifferent to the human drama surrounding it. It will outlive us. The knowledge of how to synthesize it cannot be unmade. But we care, or at least we should, and that has to matter. As you drift towards sleep, sit with this. Not the resolution, because there isn't one yet, just the truth, the unfinished weight of it, the question of what we'll choose to do next. The molecule doesn't care. It never did. But we do, and that has to matter.